You are now listening to Femme podcast with Tessa Markle
and Carolina Alvarez.
Femme. Welcome back, listeners. Thank you for tuning in again to another episode of Femme podcast. Today's guest is Jake Justice, music producer.
Hi, ladies.
Welcome to our show. Before we get started, you're welcome.
Aw. I think he's the first person
on.
to be like, thank you, ladies. I'm like, I appreciate that.
It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Why wouldn't I thank you?
Perfect. Well, we have some tea for you today. I'm letting it steep for a moment. I'll pour it while we're talking. But
Wonderful.
It is Celestial Seasonings peppermint tea.
Perfect.
So
That's my favorite.
caffeine-free, but still kind of gives you the boost, you know?
Perfect.
All right.
So you're a tea drinker. You enjoy
definitely.
the herbal every
No,
now and then?
it definitely makes me feel good. I like drinking tea at night before I go to bed. So
Oh my
it's
gosh,
nice
me
and
too.
relaxing.
It is. It totally gets you in the zone.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jake, we're so excited to have you on here. And this is what I like. Thank you for being on here. And what was awesome is when we reached out, I loved the response you gave. I wasn't expecting it. And that was just that, the whole thing that got you into music was film scores?
It was. So when I was young, my favorite movie was Star Wars. I'm talking like 3-4 years old. That was my parents raised me on Star Wars. And I think one of the most important aspects of Star Wars that makes it so iconic is the music itself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everybody can remember the melodies for Star Wars. And so I was just so captivated by the music. And so my mom started me off on piano lessons when I was around 3 or 4 years old. Now, she's a piano teacher, so definitely an advantage there.
3 or 4, dang.
Yeah. So I started playing piano when I was 3 and started taking lessons. But, my mom was the one teaching me, so it wasn't super disciplined. And you know how that can be when, you're a parent trying to teach your kid to do something. I wouldn't always listen, wouldn't always practice. I was... it's harder to listen to a parent with those sort of things. Sure. But I loved music, and it definitely came from Star Wars, from John Williams, who's the composer for Star Wars. So what I would do as I got older, like around 7 or 8, I would just listen to hours of the soundtrack, and I would kind of go to the piano and figure out how to play the songs by ear. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially how I learned how to write music. Just by listening and figuring it out. And in the process of figuring it out, I discovered all the patterns from that exist from writing music. And it was nice to learn from one of the best, because John Williams is, in my opinion, like the father of modern film music.
Mm-hmm.
So
agreed.
I mean, he's just
No, for sure.
I mean, he also, little known fact, he has more Academy Award nominations than any other person.
Very interesting.
In any category.
Wow.
Oh, in any category?
In any category, he has more nominations. Yep.
Makes sense.
He's also the only music person to have an AFI Lifetime Achievement Award.
Oh, very cool.
Every single other person is, a director, producer, whatever. He's the only film composer to have one.
That's really awesome.
So that's how my love for music began. And now, while I spend most of my time, producing music, doing electronic music, sound design, that sort of a thing, my love for music started with film scoring. And I did spend probably half of my 20s writing music for commercials, short films. So I do have experience doing film music. That's what I studied in school. And eventually I do want to get back into it as I get older, and tour life, studio life is, I want to move on from that and just stay at home. So that's part of the plan.
So whenever you're making music for film, I mean, do you feel like generally the filmmakers come to you and they're like, I want this sound? Or do you feel like you watch something and think, oh, this is what it should sound like, this is what should be, what the score should be underneath? Like,
right.
How does that work?
The ultimate purpose of a film score is to serve the film. And the director is the person who is putting together everything and has the creative vision. So ultimately, it's the film composer's job to deliver what the director wants as part of that vision. So 99% of the time, it definitely is, the director has a vision. Thank you for the tea.
Welcome. Yes.
It's finally steeped, you guys.
I love this tea time and podcasting.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah.
what was I saying? Yeah, so it's up to the film composer to deliver on the vision for the director. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll have something called temp tracks where
Okay.
they'll be like, hey, I kind of want something that sounds like this. And then they'll put the temp track on the editing bay.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they'll even like edit the film to that temp track. And a lot of the times the film composers, they'll just have to listen to the temp track and then create something similar to that. One
Okay.
great example of that, going back to Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
So the very opening scene of the original Star Wars, Episode 4, where where the rebel ship is being chased down by the big Star Destroyer,
Mm-hmm.
the original temp track for that George Lucas used was Mars from the Planets. That dun 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 dun. Look it up
Yeah.
by Holst. It's amazing. So you if you listen to that track, which was written, decades and decades and decades ago, and you compare it to John Williams' score,
Mhm.
it's quite similar.
Oh.
Interesting.
It's very similar. And I think that also just goes back to the creative process in general, where there really aren't any completely original ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Creativity is just mixing and matching ideas that already exist, combining them together, bending and breaking what's already there. So so going back to Tim tracks, that's a very commonly used part of the process
Mm-hmm.
in deciding what music to create.
Makes sense. I know
Mhm.
for us, we've struggled with figuring out exactly what kind of sound we want and deciding, do we want to just then find a song that sounds like that, put that underneath, like, just trying to figure out what we want to do. I mean, do you find, because you also produce music not for films,
Yes.
do you find that you would rather, say, have someone use one of your songs on their film that's already made, or would you rather like
Well,
write
that's
something
definitely
for a film?
that's definitely more convenient for sure.
Mhm.
Definitely. I find as a producer and an artist, one of the reasons that I'm not really focusing so much on film composing right now is because I have 100% artistic liberty to do whatever I want,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
which is really great. One thing that happens with soundtracks a lot is, you'll have a song and it'll be licensed to a publisher.
Mhm.
And the publisher's job is to essentially pitch that song to different directors, music supervisors, or whatever, and get the song placed
Mhm.
on commercials, on TV, film, whatever. So that's definitely a lot less work for the artist.
Mhm.
That being said, I can think of one example. I believe Inception, Hans Zimmer wrote all of the music before he even saw the movie.
Oh,
That's
interesting.
very rare.
What?
Very rare. And I think those sort of things only happen when the composer and the director have a really strong creative relationship and there's just a lot of trust there. Obviously, Hans Zimmer's been, I just blanked on his name.
Hans Zimmerman, right?
Hans
No.
Zimmer, no, director
Oh,
of Inception.
Inception.
Why am I blanking on his name? Christopher Nolan.
Ah,
Okay. thank
Christopher
you.
Nolan.
Thank you.
Our sound technicians are like, girl,
Come on.
that's
I
it
know,
right
that's
there.
basic film knowledge. Yeah, so Christopher Nolan and Hans Zimmer, they do pretty much everything together. So they have a really strong working relationship. So, yeah, so Hans Zimmer wrote all of the music for Inception before he even saw the movie. That is very rare, maybe like 1% of the time.
That's really cool, though.
Mhm.
What's the best way then? Like, I kind of get a vibe, like for some of our other projects, for instance, an example, like, oh, we like the kind of 70s groovy sound or
Mhm.
something. So how to do like a score under, or you know what, a better idea, or Western, right? Like
Mhm.
we like the spaghetti Western, like kind of sound. We didn't want it to get too like old in time with it, a little bit fresh. So that's why like maybe a 70s funk with it.
Gotcha.
See, the way I'm speaking to you, does that even make sense?
Makes 100% sense. It really does.
Okay.
So, one example I can think of for that is Django Unchained,
Mhm.
Quentin Tarantino.
Mhm.
My
It's
inspiration for most things.
yeah, no, but really though, I'm so excited for his upcoming movie. By
Oh,
the
me
way.
too.
Yes.
What's it called?
Once Upon a
Hollywood. Once Upon a
Time.
Time in Hollywood. Oh man,
Mhm.
really excited. So I think that's a great example where He has traditional orchestral music that that makes sense in your mind that you're used to seeing with old Western films. But then I think he has a few like super modern tracks. He has like some hip hop tracks in there, and
Oh yeah.
yeah, it's crazy, and it just totally doesn't fit. It's a total juxtaposition, but it does fit because it captures the feeling and the emotion of what's going on in the scene.
Okay.
So
So it
yeah, I
makes
like it. Yeah,
sense.
some
Yeah.
people that bugs them when they put anachronistic music, meaning that it doesn't belong with the time period. But I actually kind of like it. Another movie that does that is Great Gatsby, the most recent one
I
with
know.
Leonardo DiCaprio. That actually really upset a lot of people that they were
Yeah.
using hip hop in for the 1920s. But I read a really interesting interview with Baz Luhrmann, and what he was saying, because I think Jay-Z actually produced the whole soundtrack, and he did yeah.
Okay.
So they worked on it
Makes
together,
sense.
and their viewpoint was that at the time in the 1920s, jazz was the underground music. It was
Yeah.
the dangerous, sketchy underground music. And
Yeah.
what is
Right.
that today? Hip hop.
Exactly.
So, although now it's much more mainstream than it used to be,
Yeah.
but so they wanted to convey that same feeling. So at the time, now we listen to jazz and like, oh, this is like old timey, boring music. But in the 1920s, it was associated with crime, underground, whatever.
Yeah.
So
Makes
that's
sense.
why they chose hip hop, because they wanted to convey the danger. They wanted to convey the same feelings that jazz did at the time.
Makes
Right.
total sense. So for filmmakers working with musicians, as opposed to just, buying the rights to use a song, if you're working with a musician that's, you can either talk to personally, that, you might already have a relationship with, or you want to write something for the film, whatever it is, what's the best way to communicate? If maybe it's someone you don't have a close relationship with, but you've met, so you have their contact information, like how just reaching out in general and stuff when you're on that level, as opposed to, buying the rights to use the song.
Right. Well, I feel like most of what I've seen, like the directors do have close personal relationships with the composers. They met in college, they met, working on a small project early on in their careers. And what I see tends to happen is that these directors and composers will, like, once they kind of like find their match, they keep working together for most of the films.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So from what I see, like most people get work through word of mouth. A lot of composers will have, or big time composers will have composers' assistants. That's one way to kind of get a leg up. And then that's kind of a way to network. It's all just, about interpersonal relationships.
Yeah.
And I think it's about interpersonal relationships more than just sending out your resume or whatever, because communication is so incredibly important, and you need to have really strong communication between the director and the composer, because the director has to be able to communicate their vision in a way that makes sense for the composer. And
Right.
there's just so much back and forth that goes on between first drafts, second drafts, third drafts. A lot of problems that I've encountered personally is just the language that is used, because musicians have a set of vocabulary to describe music, and not all film directors are versed in that same vocabulary.
Right.
So as a composer, you have to be able to figure out okay, I want this to feel dark. Okay, cool. So what does that mean in musical terms? You have to be able to understand that and know how to convey that through music. It would be so much easier if every director was like, okay, for this next part, I want 3 French horns, and they're going to make a melodic motif in the key of C minor, and then it's going to lead into
Damn.
a timpani. Yeah, they don't talk like that, right?
Nope.
No.
No. It would be so easy if they
I mean,
could.
I have some music knowledge, but I wouldn't even think
Right.
in that way, which is like eye-opening, like totally. Like, okay, maybe I should start to build on that, since I do have some background.
I would
I
say
do have background in music.
Of course, yeah. And I think it definitely helps to have a basic understanding of music theory, and maybe just like what instrument sounds like what. For example, I had a director that I worked with once who really wanted an oboe and for one part. But what he really wanted was a flute, but he didn't know that, they
Yeah.
just,
What instrument sounded like
yeah.
what?
So,
Yeah.
so
Oboe and flute are very
right.
different.
So I would say for directors, what would be really great, just have a basic knowledge of what instrument sounds like what,
Yeah.
and also just having a general knowledge of film scores, great film scores of the past.
Mm-hmm.
So you can identify maybe like, okay, I want this to sound really bright and hopeful. This reminds me of this soundtrack
Mm-hmm.
from Forrest Gump.
Mm-hmm.
And just being able to make connections like that. Because if you say, okay, I want it to sound like, going back to like the temp track sort of thing, that's why
Yeah.
those are used a lot, then that is very helpful to the composer, because then the composer can listen to the song and identify what aspects of it make it sound hopeful or bright or whatever.
Right.
Interesting.
That.
So that's a lot right there just to take in. That's very helpful as far as your score for your film, because obviously, you need music throughout the film. Like there are certain films that have moments of silence that make sense, but in general, yeah, you need
helps
music
build
underneath all of it.
The tension,
Right.
and when you're having action, like if it was
It
just
makes
silent, it totally like
Right. Well,
the-
John Williams has a great quote though. If he once said that if I can write a full score and nobody noticed that it was there, I've done my job.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So some of the best scores are just are the ones that blend in so perfectly with the film that you don't even notice that it's there. It's kind of like, it's like wallpaper.
It makes
Like
you
walk
feel without
in.
even being aware of it. Yeah.
But if it was gone, you would notice.
yeah,
right.
exactly.
But it's not something you think about. It's there to enhance the emotion that's already being conveyed by the film, not to distract from it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm laughing because I'm going to touch on this in my little inspiration of the week, but I watched Mulholland Drive
Mhm.
for the first time like 2 weeks ago, and that 80s like soundtrack, like it was tension building, but oh boy, it was there. Like whatever,
Right.
like
Was it
sympathy.
distracting?
Right.
Oh, it was. But I get it, they were like building, but I was like, oh.
Well, sometimes that can be an artistic choice,
and which
but
I
I
think
feel
it
like
probably was.
yeah, it
Knowing
could've-
David Lynch, I'm sure it was.
It's so hard for me these days to even make any sort of criticisms about films, because just knowing what the entire process is and how much thought and work and effort and hours and lack of sleep and blood, sweat, and tears goes into it, it's like nothing but respect. Like it's really hard for me to criticize films and to criticize artistic choices.
Oh, totally.
Mhm.
So, but that being said, I think in general, the audience will have a more engaging experience when they aren't necessarily noticing the music, when it's just part of the
That's
whole.
interesting. Yeah, that's
in
a
general.
good way to look at another perspective on that.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it. So for like if for song covers, do you know the legalities that go into that at all?
Song covers meaning
Like let's say
As opposed to a soundtrack to have, that
yes.
one song.
Yeah,
in
yeah.
there.
So one example I can think of is the movie Crazy Rich Asians.
Mhm.
They did the song Yellow by Coldplay, but they did like an acoustic Chinese version of it, and it was in Mandarin. So I what you have to do is you have to get, and they did get the rights. They get permission from Coldplay or from their record label or whatever. And in that case, they probably got a licensing fee.
Mhm.
So I don't think they would get any royalties from that, because it is a different recording. So the song, there's two aspects of it. There's the song itself, which is like the lyrics, the melody, whatever. And then there's the recording of it.
Mhm.
right.
So you can own the song, as in you wrote the lyrics, you wrote the melody,
Correct.
you wrote everything. And then you can own the actual master recording of it. So when when music supervisors are trying to find pre-existing songs to put onto their films, they're licensing either the master recording or the song itself, which would be like a cover. So that would be two different fees. And it just depends on how big the song is. Obviously, since it was Coldplay, they probably had to pay a pretty penny for it.
Definitely.
But if it's a lesser known song, sometimes, for example, I know Grey's Anatomy, was pretty famous for finding unknown artists and actually kind of making them big just by placing them on the TV show. And I don't think, obviously, those licensing fees were very large.
Right.
Yeah. Is there do you know of a website maybe for filmmakers? I struggle with this sometimes, trying to find the right copyright, like either the record labels or I've heard
Like
one.
who owns the rights to what and how to.
You would need to reach out to the publishing companies.
Okay.
That's what you
Okay.
do. Yeah. Not necessarily the record label, but the
Okay.
publishing companies are the ones that are in charge of that in general.
And it matters too how much of the song you have in there, right? Like the length of, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like, so for example, you could even, I know a lot of people will license off like the instrumental versions of this song that don't have the lyrics, or even just like 10-second sound bites of it.
Okay.
So that would be an even smaller fee,
Okay.
most likely.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of knowledge already, and it's super helpful. Thank you so much for coming
Thanks
in
for
today.
having me. It's a good conversation.
I'm glad we got to have this little talk. But I want our listeners to be able to find you, to find your work. What's the best place to find you?
I would just go on Spotify. Just look up Jake Justice on Spotify. I actually just released a song last Friday called Gladiators.
Awesome.
It is
And
super good,
What's
guys.
interesting, well, and this all kind of ties together. So the music that I make now, it definitely has some orchestral cinematic elements to it, even though it's a hip hop song.
Yeah.
So,
Love it.
so if you take a listen, it's called Gladiators, and look it up, Jake Justice on Spotify. You'll definitely hear the cinematic elements to it.
Perfect tie-in.
Perfect. I love it.
Well, thank you, listeners.
Thank you
Thanks for
so
having
much,
me.
Jake.
Yes.
This is so fun.
And we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to Femme Regard podcast. If you like what you hear, tune in next time for more tips on the filmmaking business and insightful conversations with industry professionals over tea.
We can only grow with your support, so please subscribe, share, rate, and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. If you leave us a great comment, we might give you a shout out on the show. For more on us, check us out at femregard.com.